Welcome to the deep dive. So if you've been following European politics at all, I mean, even a little, over the last couple of years, you know that Germany's undergoing a fundamental, historic transformation. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the source material you've shared to unpack that very shift, which the Germans call the Zeitenwende.
Or the turning point.
Exactly. And let's unpack this because it is a monumental change. Our sources confirm the Zeitenwende is the single most consequential departure from Germany's foundational post-war identity.
That identity of a Zivilmacht, a civilian power.
Right. For decades, the Federal Republic relied on economic diplomacy, multilateralism, and kept military ambition very, very low.
And this started as, just rhetoric right after the invasion of Ukraine. But by 2025, it's become a full structural shift.
It really has.
But what's fascinating here and what makes this so urgent for you to understand is the core paradox.
Go on.
Germany is rapidly rebuilding a serious military capacity. At the exact moment, the global order is shifting away from that long period of U.S.-dominated unipolarity.
Towards something much more contested, more fragmented.
Exactly, a multipolar world. And when these big systemic transitions happen, well, scholars like Professor Sachs, whose work we're analyzing, they all agree the risks of conflict and miscalculation just spike.
So our mission here is to cut through all that complexity. We need to figure out how Germany is trying to reconcile its massive economic centrality in Europe,
Which is undeniable.
with its deeply entrenched history of, frankly, military underperformance.
And crucially, we have to explore why this whole effort, as Professor Sachs frames it in his analysis, might unintentionally make things worse, might intensify broader insecurity.
Simply by happening inside a global structure that's already, well, disintegrating.
Right.
Okay, so let's begin where the rubber meets the road. The immediate operational shock that really spurred this whole thing on.
The Division 2025 initiative.
Exactly. And this is more than just a numbers target, isn't it? It's a symbolic marker. It's designed to provide NATO with a fully equipped, combat-ready formation.
That can handle sustained, high-intensity, peer-to-peer conflict.
It's Berlin signaling its intent to shift from being a security consumer, relying on others, to becoming a credible security provider.
And that transition is desperately needed because the reality check they got in early 2025 was, to put it mildly, brutal.
How so?
Despite all the huge funding commitments made right after the Zeitenwende was announced, the Bundeswehr still lacked a single, fully combat-ready division, not one.
Wow.
You had senior figures from Germany's defense industry saying, with just astonishing bluntness, that Germany, in its current state, could maybe defend a city like Augsburg.
A mid-sized city.
Right. But it absolutely could not defend Munich or Berlin against a serious peer adversary.
That is just a staggering admission for the economic engine of Europe.
It is. And this fragility, this operational hollowness, it's rooted in decades of historical dependence.
Germany is still structurally dependent on, about 38,500 U.S. Army personnel stationed on its soil?
That's right. Providing everything from logistics to high-end air defense. That asymmetry, Germany's huge economic weight versus its military weakness, that's what the Zeitenwende has to correct.
And to correct it, they needed a revolution in procurement.
A total revolution in how they buy and manage equipment. For years, the Bundeswehr had this policy called dynamic availability.
What did that mean in practice?
It meant equipment tanks, artillery, you name it, was shared. It was rotated between units.
So no single unit was ever fully equipped and ready to go at a moment's notice?
Never. They have now definitively abandoned that for what's called full capitalization. Every unit gets all its required gear all the time.
And the scale of buying that followed is, while it's truly historic, the numbers are worth focusing on for a second because they just show the speed of this pivot.
They're incredible.
So look at the period from 2015 to 2022. The Ministry of Defense approved 215 projects totaling around 109 billion euros.
Okay, that's the baseline.
Now look at the acceleration. Just between 2023 and 2025, Germany approved 255 major projects valued at a staggering 188.4 billion euros.
It's not reform. Like you said, it's a buying frenzy.
It is, and the inflection point really came in 2025.
The Bundestag authorized, 103 major projects worth 83 billion euros in the first half of the year alone.
And then followed it up with another 52 billion for 29 more contracts that December. We're talking hundreds of billions committed to physical hardware in just 3 years.
So let's talk about what they're buying. because the choices they're making really reveal their long-term strategic thinking.
Right. And the most important choice has to be the F-35A Lightning II.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
This anchors Germany's nuclear sharing role firmly inside the U.S.-centric ecosystem. It's a conscious choice for interoperability with Washington.
Over, say, a deeper European strategic autonomy project.
Precisely. And at the same time, look at air and missile defense. Germany is leading this thing called the European Sky Shield Initiative, or ESSI.
This is a massive, layered continental shield.
It is. And it's integrating U.S. systems, Israeli systems, specifically the Arrow 3 interceptors, which cost about 3 billion euros.
And their own indigenous IRST systems.
Yes. It shows they're building defense not just for themselves, but for the continent. They're accepting that role of a regional security anchor.
But to pay for all this, they had to pull off a political miracle. The sources call it the fiscal revolution.
Which meant the death of a long-held political orthodoxy in Germany.
The Black Zero.
Exactly. The commitment to running zero-net new debt, which had defined German finance since 2009.
This wasn't just policy. This was practically constitutional, enforced by the Schuldenbremse, the debt brake.
And they passed a constitutional amendment in early 2025 to change it. It specifically exempts defense spending above 1% of GDP from those borrowing rules. For so many, this was abandoning a sacred political cow.
The ambition is just enormous. Spending is projected to go from 86 billion euros in 2025 to over 108 billion in 2026.
And the target keeps climbing. They're aiming for 3% of GDP by 2027, maybe even 3.5% after that.
Plus, we can't forget that separate 500 billion euro fund for defense modernization and infrastructure.
And if you connect this to the bigger picture, it fundamentally changes how military spending is viewed.
How so?
It's no longer seen as, discretionary. It's a precondition for economic stability.
So it's an investment, not a cost.
That's the argument. Goldman Sachs economists, for instance, estimate this pivot could actually lift Germany's GDP growth, maybe up to 2% by 2027. They're treating this defense spending as a kind of macroeconomic stabilizer.
That makes sense fiscally, but we all know money alone doesn't create soldiers.
No, it doesn't.
Which brings us to the most binding constraint on the whole Zeitenwende personnel.
The ultimate bottleneck.
Germany has a parliamentary target of 260,000 troops by 2035. But our sources say NATO planning demands force levels closer to 395,000.
That's an 80+% increase from where they are now. You can buy all the F-35s and tanks you want.
But if you don't have the trained people to operate and maintain them, the money is just sitting there.
It's inert. And you can see this tension between the urgency and the reality in the warnings from Defense Minister Boris Pistorius.
And what was that warning?
Pistorius, who's really become the face of this revival, warned publicly that NATO must be prepared for a possible Russian conflict as early as next year.
That's an incredibly urgent timeline.
It is. But how do you meet an 80% personnel increase when recruitment is tight and things like conscription are still so contentious? The procurement might be at war speed, but the personnel system is stuck in peacetime mode.
This also brings up questions about R&D, about innovation for the future.
Right. Germany's made progress. They're at about 1.4 billion euros in defense R&D. But proportionally,
It's still not much.
it's only around 0.05% of GDP. That's still roughly half of what France commits, relatively speaking.
And that R&D asymmetry is critical because it points to future capability gaps.
Gaps in AI, hypersonics, autonomous platforms,
Yeah.
all the next generation stuff. If you aren't investing heavily there, you're basically accepting your continued dependence on Washington for high-end tech.
And if we look across Europe, the strategic cost of fragmentation is just immense.
It's a huge problem.
Europe fields 3 different 4th-gen plus jets: the Eurofighter, the French Rafale, the Swedish Gripen.
While the U.S. converges on the F-35, this duplication just dilutes R&D, it kills economies of scale, and it really undermines interoperability. It limits Europe's own military muscle.
So Germany's R&D surge is a good step, but it can't overcome that structural reality. It's still tied to the U.S. ecosystem, and the European system is too fragmented to innovate at the scale they need.
That's the bottom line.
Okay, let's shift to alliance management. How is Germany actually using this new influence? The sources are very clear that the key relationship in the East is with Poland.
And it's now defined by shared vulnerability and reinforcement, not some latent rivalry. The 1990 border treaty is seen as absolutely irrevocable.
Which removes any historical pretext for revisionism and lets them focus purely on defense.
And that reinforcement is tangible, it's not just talk. In April 2025, Germany activated the 45th Panzer Brigade in Lithuania.
This is historic. You have to understand, this is the first permanent forward deployment of a full German brigade abroad since the Second World War.
Roughly 5,000 personnel embedded directly on NATO's eastern flank.
And that's complemented by logistics. Berlin has also committed engineering units for Poland, starting in April 2026, to support their East Shield defensive network.
Which tells us a lot about the doctrinal change. This is a profound shift toward genuine forward defense.
Deterrence by denial.
Exactly. The focus is on preventing any territorial loss in critical spots like the Suwałki Gap. The idea is to make the initial cost for an aggressor so high that the attack is abandoned before it even really starts.
It's about stopping it immediately, not fighting to get territory back later.
Correct.
Now, moving west, let's look at the transatlantic relationship, especially around the Ukraine peace process.
Germany's approach here is really interesting. It's not obstructionism. They aren't trying to derail things. It's better understood as strategic refinement.
So while Washington might be focused on, say, rapid conflict termination,
And transactional burden sharing.
Berlin is more focused on the long-term durability of whatever post-war order emerges.
You saw this clearly in the Berlin talks with President Zelensky, the U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff, and Chancellor Merz.
The Europeans committed to supporting U.S.-led efforts, but they insisted that security guarantees, sovereignty, those things were integral to any stable outcome.
They weren't just nodding along. In fact, there was concrete pushback. France, Germany, and the UK put forward a 28-point counterproposal.
Aimed at moderating provisions they saw as too favorable to Russia. One diplomat even called the talks endlessly frustrating.
And this is exactly where Professor Sachs' framework is so illuminating. He argues that in these declining hegemonic systems, the dominant power, the U.S. in this case, refuses to die.
It substitutes coercion for managed transition.
Right. And you get this transactional burden sharing where the alliance feels more like a series of demands. German insistence on strategic refinement is classic middle power hedging. They're trying to balance their dependence on the U.S. with a desire for a more durable outcome.
This really brings us to the biggest question. What does all this, the Zeitenwende, mean for the international system itself?
Sachs's broader diagnosis is pretty stark. He argues that systemic pressures are just narrowing the space for any kind of stable equilibrium.
So the Zeitenwende is happening in a world where the very institutional foundations Germany built its success on are eroding.
And he details two critical dynamics shaping this. The first is hegemonic overextension.
The dominant power, the U.S., resists losing its relative power through coercion sanctions, financial weaponization.
And this makes security guarantees feel conditional. It creates real unease among allies like Germany, whose autonomy gets curtailed.
And the second dynamic is what he calls alliance compression.
Which is maybe even more alarming. Western pressure, the sanctions, again, is having the unintended effect of accelerating coordination among non-Western powers.
You mean like BRICS convergence, non-dollar settlements?
Exactly. The policy aimed at preventing a consolidated continental alignment is, paradoxically, helping to catalyze the very thing it fears.
So this is the core contradiction for Germany. Berlin is accelerating its rearmament to preserve an order whose foundations are disintegrating under its feet.
And this massive rearmament has to happen at peacetime speed, bogged down by bureaucracy and those personnel bottlenecks, despite all the political warnings of immediate urgency.
So, to consolidate this for you, the axes of this shift are, first, remilitarization and innovation, where the will is high but the implementation is bottlenecked.
Second, transatlantic mediation, where Berlin is trying to be a stabilizing, refining force.
And third, Eastern stabilization, which is a genuine historic realignment through forward deployment.
Precisely. And the key takeaway is that the Zeitenwende is not a confident return to some past stability. It's an adaptation to a world where stability itself is now provisional.
As Sachs argues, the idea that any one action could restore the pre-2020 order is just illusory.
Our final paradox, then, is that Germany is arming itself just as the international system is fragmenting.
Division 2025 is less an achieved military capability right now and more a profound stress test. A test of Germany's ability to convert raw economic power into usable military force.
All while fighting those demographic and institutional constraints.
The historical parallel that Professor Sachs draws to the pre-1914 era is intentionally cautionary. It's not a prediction.
Right. Germany's rearmament is clearly necessary for deterrence against a direct threat. But deterrence alone isn't enough anymore.
Not in a world this interdependent, where a crisis in one region just ripples through global supply chains, energy markets, and alliance commitments almost instantly.
This leaves us with one final provocative question for you to consider as you digest all this.
Will Germany's immense effort be judged in retrospect as prudential foresight that successfully stabilized Europe in a moment of extreme danger, or as a fatal entanglement in a disintegrating global structure?